When people remember the Green Mile, they often remember the tears first. They remember the long prison corridor. They remember the silence before the execution. They remember Tom Hanks standing there as Paul Edgecombe, a man forced to witness something he knew in his heart was wrong. And above all, they remember Michael Clarke Duncan as John Coffey, a towering man with the soul of a child, a voice that trembled with innocence, and eyes that seemed to carry every sorrow in the world. But behind the camera, behind the Oscar nominations, behind the unforgettable scenes that still break hearts decades later, there was another story. A quieter story. A story about two men, Tom Hanks and Michael Clarke Duncan, who met on a movie set and created something neither of them could have fully understood at the time. Because The Green Mile was not just another film. It became a monument. It became the role that changed Michael Clarke Duncan's life forever. And for Tom Hanks, it became a reminder that sometimes the person standing beside you in a scene is not just a co-star. Sometimes they become part of your memory forever. Michael Clarke Duncan did not arrive in Hollywood through the easy door. His journey was not polished, privileged, or predictable. Before the fame, before the red carpets, before audiences around the world knew his name, he had lived a life built on labor, survival, discipline, and sacrifice. He had worked security. He had protected others. He had carried his size like armor. But those who knew him often spoke about the kindness behind that powerful frame. That contrast became his gift. Hollywood first saw the body. The audience came to know the heart. And no role revealed that heart more powerfully than John Coffey. In 1999, when The Green Mile brought Tom Hanks and Michael Clarke Duncan together, Hanks was already one of the most respected actors in the world. Duncan, meanwhile, was stepping into the role that would define his career. The pressure must have been enormous. He was not just playing a supporting character. He was carrying the emotional weight of the entire film. John Coffey had to be frightening at first glance, but gentle the moment he spoke. He had to seem larger than life, yet painfully human. He had to make the audience believe in miracles, injustice, fear, mercy, and grief all at once. And Michael Clarke Duncan did exactly that. Opposite Tom Hanks, he did not disappear. He rose. Their scenes together did not feel like ordinary acting. They felt like two souls meeting in a place neither of them wanted to be. Hanks played the man with authority, but Duncan played the man with truth. The result was something rare, a performance so vulnerable that it made millions of viewers forget they were watching a movie. For many actors, one role can open doors. For Michael Clarke Duncan, The Green Mile opened hearts. The film became a commercial and critical success, and Duncan's performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. But awards only tell part of the story. The deeper impact was emotional. People did not just admire Michael Clarke Duncan in that role. They mourned with him. They feared for him. They wanted to protect him. That is the rarest kind of screen presence. Years later, when Michael Clarke Duncan passed away, the news hit Hollywood with a special kind of sadness. He was only 54. According to reports at the time, he had suffered a heart attack in July 2012 and never fully recovered before his death that September. And then came Tom Hanks' words. They were not loud. They were not theatrical. They were not made for gossip. They were the words of a man who had lost someone he respected. Hanks remembered him as Big Mike and spoke of him as the treasure discovered on the set of The Green Mile. He described the loss as stunning, and the emotion behind those words said more than any long interview ever could. Because for Tom Hanks, Michael Clarke Duncan was not only the man who played John Coffey. He was the man who brought warmth into rooms. The man whose presence could fill a set, not just because of his size, but because of his spirit. The man who could make people laugh, even in moments of grief. At Duncan's memorial, Hanks also shared a humorous story from Duncan's childhood, turning a funeral moment into laughter, not to minimize the pain, but to honor the joy Duncan carried with him. That was the truth Tom Hanks seemed to reveal. Michael Clarke Duncan's legacy was not tragedy alone. Yes, his death was heartbreaking. Yes, he left too soon. Yes, Fans still wonder what roles he might have played, what performances he might have given, what chapters were stolen from him. But the greater truth is this. Michael Clarke Duncan left behind something that death could not erase. He left behind John Coffey. He left behind that voice. He left behind the memory of a gentle giant who made the world cry, not because he demanded sympathy, but because he made innocence feel real. And when Tom Hanks spoke about him, it reminded everyone that the magic of the Green Mile was not only written in the script. It was in Michael. And perhaps that is why, even now, years after his passing, people still return to that film. They return to the corridor. They return to the tears. They return to the impossible question at the center of the story. How can someone so gentle be treated so cruelly? But behind that question is another one. How did Michael Clarke Duncan, a man who fought so hard to reach Hollywood, give one performance so powerful that it made the world remember him forever? That answer begins long before the Green Mile. And it reveals why Tom Hanks never forgot him. Before Michael Clarke Duncan became the man audiences knew as John Coffey, he was just a boy from Chicago with a dream that seemed almost impossible. He was born into a world where nothing was handed to him. Life did not open its arms and say, "Come in, Michael. Hollywood is waiting." Instead, life tested him early. He grew up on the south side of Chicago, raised by a mother who worked hard and expected strength from her children. His father was not a steady presence in his life. And because of that, Michael learned early that love and responsibility often came from the people who stayed, not the people who disappeared. His mother wanted better for him. She wanted safety. She wanted stability. She wanted him to avoid the streets and the dangers that swallowed too many young men before they ever had a chance to become who they were meant to be. And Michael listened. But he also dreamed. He had the body of an athlete, the discipline of a worker, and the heart of a performer. Yet dreaming of Hollywood from where he stood was not easy. For many people around him, acting was not a plan. It was fantasy. It was something other people did, people with connections, money, agents, and perfect timing. Michael had none of that. What he had was belief. Still, belief alone does not pay bills. So before the world saw him on screen, Michael Clarke Duncan worked. He dug ditches. He worked security. He took jobs that demanded physical endurance. He became a bodyguard for celebrities, standing in the background while others lived the fame he secretly wanted for himself. Imagine that. Imagine protecting stars while knowing, somewhere deep down, that you wanted to be more than the man standing beside the spotlight. You wanted to step into it. For some, that kind of life would create bitterness. For Michael, it seemed to create patience. He understood the industry from the outside before he ever entered it from within. He saw how fame worked. He saw how people changed around it. And maybe that is why, when fame finally came to him, people often said he remained grounded. He knew what life looked like before applause. That is important to understand, because Michael Clarke Duncan's success did not happen overnight, even if it seemed sudden to the public. He appeared in small roles. He took parts that used his size more than his soul. Hollywood often saw him as the big man, the guard, the muscle, the intimidating figure. That was the easiest box to put him in. But Michael had more. Much more. Then came a friendship that helped change his path. Bruce Willis. After working together, Willis reportedly encouraged Michael for the role of John Coffey in The Green Mile. That recommendation would become one of the most important turns in Duncan's life. Because when the opportunity came, Michael was ready, not just physically, but emotionally. John Coffey was not a role a man could fake. The character required a kind of spiritual nakedness. He had to be enormous, but not aggressive. Innocent, but not simple. Afraid, but not weak. He had to speak softly enough to make the audience lean in, yet carry enough pain to break them when they did. Michael Clarke Duncan understood that. Maybe because he knew what it meant to be misjudged by appearance. Maybe because he knew what it meant for people to see the body before they saw the person. Maybe because beneath his strength, there was always sensitivity. And that sensitivity came through every time he shared the screen with Tom Hanks. Their chemistry was not loud. It did not need jokes, explosions, or dramatic speeches. It was built on stillness. Tom Hanks brought the quiet moral weight of Paul Edgecombe, a man trapped inside the rules of a cruel system. Michael brought the impossible tenderness of John Coffey, a man who could heal others but could not save himself. Together, they created something unforgettable. One of the most powerful things about their scenes is how much is communicated without explanation. Hank's character begins by seeing Coffey as a prisoner. Slowly, he begins to see him as a miracle. But the audience sees that transformation through Hank's face. The doubt, the fear, the guilt, the dawning realization that this man is not what the world says he is. And Duncan makes that transformation believable. He does not demand our sympathy. He earns our trust. That is why Tom Hanks' later tribute carried so much weight. It was not just an actor praising another actor. It was a witness remembering the person who helped make one of his most emotional films so powerful. Because Hanks had seen Michael's gift up close. He had seen the discipline, the humility, the nervous energy of a man stepping into a career-defining role. He had seen the humor between takes, the warmth, the humanity. And he had seen how Michael could step from laughter into heartbreak as soon as the camera rolled. That kind of ability cannot be manufactured. It comes from somewhere real. After the Green Mile, Michael Clarke Duncan became more than a familiar face. He became beloved. He appeared in action films, comedies, dramas, and animated projects. His voice became instantly recognizable, deep, rich, comforting, and powerful. But no matter how many roles he played, people always returned to John Coffey. For some actors, that might feel like a burden. To be remembered for one role can sometimes feel limiting. But for Michael, it became a legacy. Because John Coffey was not just a character. He was the role that revealed who Michael Clarke Duncan could be when Hollywood gave him room to be more than muscle. It proved that the man often cast for his size could move audiences with softness. It proved that power on screen does not always come from anger. Sometimes, power comes from gentleness. And that gentleness is what people mourned when he died. Not just the actor. Not just the celebrity. They mourned the feeling he gave them. They mourned the man who seemed, even from a distance, to carry joy with him. The man whose smile could make interviews feel warmer. The man whose laugh sounded too big to be contained. The man who had fought his way from hard jobs and background roles to an Oscar-nominated performance that still lives in cinema history. Tom Hanks understood that Michael's story was not simply about fame. It was about the long road to being seen. And maybe that is why his words after Michael's death felt so honest. Because he was not trying to create a legend. The legend was already there. Michael Clarke Duncan had become proof that sometimes the person Hollywood overlooks the longest is the person audiences remember the deepest. But even after the success, even after the admiration, even after the applause, there was a sadness waiting at the edge of the story. A sadness no one expected to come so soon. The saddest part of Michael Clarke Duncan's story is not only that he died young. It is that he had spent so many years climbing toward the life he wanted, and when he finally reached it, time did not give him as much as he deserved. That is what makes his legacy feel so emotional. He was not a child star who grew up inside the Hollywood machine. He was not someone whose fame was planned from the beginning. He was a man who had known ordinary struggle before extraordinary success. He had worked jobs where nobody asked for autographs. He had stood behind celebrities before becoming one. He had carried the weight of responsibility before carrying the weight of a major film role. So when success came, it felt earned. And perhaps that is why audiences connected with him so deeply. There was something real in his presence. Even when he played intimidating characters, there was often warmth underneath. Even when his voice thundered, there was gentleness behind it. He did not feel manufactured. He felt human. After the Green Mile, doors opened. Michael appeared in films like Armageddon, The Whole Nine Yards, Planet of the Apes, Daredevil, and Sin City. Some roles were big, some were brief, but he always brought something memorable. His size made him impossible to ignore, but his personality made him impossible to forget. Still, Hollywood did not always know what to do with him. That is another quiet tragedy. An actor like Michael Clarke Duncan had already proved he could handle emotional depth. He had already shown that he could make audiences cry with a whisper. He had already earned one of the highest honors an actor can receive, an Oscar nomination. Yet too often, the industry still circled back to the obvious. The big man, the bodyguard, the fighter, the heavy. He could do those roles well, but he could do more. And anyone who watched The Green Mile knew it. That film remains the argument for everything Michael Clarke Duncan could have become if Hollywood had taken even more chances on him. He had the capacity for tenderness, tragedy, comedy, authority, fear, and innocence. He could make a scene feel safer just by entering it, or more dangerous simply by standing still. That combination is rare. Tom Hanks understood rare talent. By the time he worked with Michael, Hanks had already built a career on emotional intelligence. He knew what it meant to make audiences believe in ordinary decency. He knew how powerful restraint could be. And perhaps that is why he recognized something special in Duncan's performance. Michael was not overplaying John Coffey. He was protecting him. That distinction matters. A lesser actor might have turned John Coffey into a symbol only, a saint, a victim, a miracle wrapped in suffering. But Michael made him a person. He gave him fear, confusion, humor, pain. He made him breathe. He made him childlike without making him foolish. He made him powerful without making him threatening. That balance is what made the performance immortal. And it is what made Tom Hanks' grief resonate years later. When Hanks remembered Michael publicly, people did not hear empty Hollywood politeness. They heard the sadness of someone who knew what had been lost. Not just a former co-star, but a force of kindness. Someone whose presence had made one of the most emotionally demanding films of Hanks' career feel human behind the scenes. Because film sets are strange places. Audiences see only the finished story, polished and edited. They do not see the long hours, the repetition, the exhaustion, the small conversations between takes. They do not see the jokes that help actors survive difficult material. They do not see the trust that must exist when two performers are asked to create pain together for the camera. On The Green Mile, that trust mattered. The story was heavy. The themes were dark. The emotional atmosphere was intense. But people who worked with Michael often described him as joyful, funny, and generous. That kind of energy can change a set. It can make painful scenes bearable. It can remind everyone that behind the tragedy being performed, there are living people trying to tell the truth. Tom Hanks' tribute revealed that side of Michael. Not the prisoner, not the doomed miracle worker, not the screen image frozen forever in a death row cell. The man. Big Mike. The friend who could make people laugh. The colleague who left behind affection instead of ego. The actor whose kindness became as important to remember as his performance. And that is why his death in 2012 felt so cruel. He was only 54, an age when many actors begin entering some of their richest work. He had lived enough life to bring depth to mature roles. He had enough experience to command respect. He had enough goodwill from audiences to continue building something lasting. But suddenly, the future stopped. There would be no second Oscar-nominated dramatic role, no late career renaissance, no long series of interviews where he looked back on The Green Mile with age, humor, and wisdom, no chance for new generations of directors to rediscover him and write roles worthy of his emotional range. That is the part fans still feel. Not only what happened, but what never got to happen. And yet, Michael Clarke Duncan did not leave behind an unfinished memory. He left behind a complete feeling. The feeling of a man who came from struggle, fought his way into Hollywood, and used one unforgettable role to show the world his soul. Tom Hanks' silence, and then his words, mattered because they gave fans permission to remember Michael not as a tragedy, but as a gift. A man who made the people around him better. A man who proved that gentleness could be stronger than brutality. A man who turned a fictional character into a permanent emotional wound in cinema history. But behind every wound, there is a story. And behind Michael's most famous performance, there were moments that revealed exactly why the world fell in love with him. One of the reasons Michael Clarke Duncan remains so unforgettable is that his story feels almost cinematic even before the movies began. He was not built by Hollywood. He arrived carrying a lifetime of experience that no acting class could fully teach. He understood fear because he had seen hard streets. He understood work because he had done jobs that exhausted the body. He understood humility because he had spent years close to fame without being famous himself. And he understood hope because for a long time, hope was the only thing that kept the dream alive. That is why John Coffey felt so real. When Michael Clarke Duncan stepped into that role, he was not simply pretending to be a gentle giant. In some ways, he was revealing a truth people around him already knew. Beneath the enormous frame was a man with tenderness, discipline, humor, and emotional intelligence. Tom Hanks saw that up close. On screen, Hanks and Duncan created one of the most heartbreaking actor partnerships of the late 1990s. But behind the camera, their connection worked because there was respect. Hanks did not need to overpower the scenes. Duncan did not need to prove he belonged. Together, they let the story breathe. That is harder than it looks. In emotional films, actors can sometimes push too much. They can chase tears. They can turn pain into performance. But The Green Mile worked because so much of it felt restrained. The pain was not shouted at the audience. It was allowed to settle slowly, scene by scene, until viewers realized they were carrying the same dread as the characters. Michael's performance was central to that feeling. He made John Coffey frightening only for a moment. After that, the fear disappeared and something else took its place: protection. The audience began wanting to protect him. That emotional reversal was the miracle of the role. The man introduced as a condemned prisoner became the moral center of the entire film. And Tom Hanks, as Paul Edgecombe, became the audience's witness. Through Hanks' eyes, viewers slowly discovered the truth. Through Duncan's eyes, they felt the injustice. Neither actor could have created that power alone. It required balance. One man carrying guilt, the other carrying innocence. That is why, decades later, their scenes still hurt. But what makes Michael Clarke Duncan's legacy even more moving is that his real-life personality was often the opposite of the sadness people associate with John Coffey. Those who worked with him remembered laughter. They remembered generosity. They remembered a man who loved telling stories, loved making people smile, and never seemed to let success erase the worker he had once been. That matters because fame can change people. It can make them distant. It can make them guarded. It can make them forget the years when nobody knew their name. But Michael seemed to carry gratitude with him. He knew what it meant to be overlooked. He knew what it meant to wait. So when recognition finally came, he did not treat it like something ordinary. He treated it like a blessing. Still, blessings do not protect anyone from heartbreak. After The Green Mile, Michael's career continued, but fans often wondered why Hollywood did not give him more roles with the same emotional depth. He had already proved he could handle a character filled with spiritual weight. He had already shown that he could stand beside Tom Hanks and not be overshadowed. He had already earned the kind of audience love that most actors spend decades chasing. But the industry can be limited in its imagination. It often sees what is easiest to sell. For Michael, that meant his size was sometimes treated as his main feature, when his true power was his soul. He could play strength, yes, but he could also play vulnerability. He could play comedy. He could play sorrow. He could play warmth. He had a voice that could sound like thunder, but also like comfort. That range was still waiting to be fully explored. And that is part of the sorrow Tom Hanks' tribute seemed to carry. When someone like Michael dies, people do not only mourn the life that ended. They mourn the future that disappeared with him, the roles he never played, the stories he never told. The older, wiser version of him audiences never got to see. Imagine Michael Clarke Duncan in his 60s, playing a father with regrets. Imagine him as a retired fighter learning peace. Imagine him as a preacher carrying secrets. Imagine him in a quiet drama where he did not have to be physically imposing at all, just human, wounded, funny, and real. Those possibilities are now only imagination. But sometimes one role is enough to make a person permanent. For Michael Clarke Duncan, John Coffey became that role, not because it was his only achievement, but because it captured something essential about him. The world saw the giant first, then discovered the gentleness. That was true of the character, and in many ways, it was true of the actor's public image as well. Tom Hanks' words after Michael's death reminded people of that gentleness. He did not speak about a co-star as a career footnote. He spoke about a man whose presence mattered, a man whose passing felt stunning, a man remembered with affection, not just admiration. And that distinction is important. Admiration is what people give to talent. Affection is what people give to character. Michael Clarke Duncan had both. That is why his death still feels personal to so many fans who never met him. They did not know his daily life. They did not sit with him between takes. They did not hear all the stories Tom Hanks and others remembered, but they felt something through the screen that seemed honest. They felt decency. They felt pain. They felt a rare kind of softness inside a powerful man. And maybe that is why The Green Mile remains more than a movie. It has become a place people return to when they want to feel something deep. It is a film about injustice, mercy, fear, and the unbearable cost of doing what the world demands when your conscience knows better. At the center of that story stands Michael Clarke Duncan, not as a shadow behind Tom Hanks, not as a supporting player who simply filled a role, but as the beating heart of the film. And when Tom Hanks finally spoke about what Michael meant, it was not only a tribute to a friend. It was a reminder that some actors do not need 100 iconic roles to become unforgettable. Sometimes, one performance is enough to echo forever. To understand why Michael Clarke Duncan's loss still feels so heavy, you have to understand what he represented. He was not just an actor who found success. He was the kind of person audiences wanted to believe in. He had a presence that felt sincere. In an industry often filled with carefully managed images, Michael seemed different. He felt open. He felt grateful. He felt like a man who had not forgotten the long road behind him. That is why his death created such a deep emotional reaction. Fans did not simply say, "A famous actor has died." They said, "Big Mike is gone." That nickname mattered. It carried warmth. It carried familiarity. It made him feel less like a distant Hollywood figure and more like someone people somehow knew. And when Tom Hanks used that name while remembering him, it revealed the affection behind the professional respect. Because there are co-stars you work with, and then there are co-stars you remember. Michael Clarke Duncan became the second kind. On The Green Mile, Tom Hanks had already worked with many great actors. He knew what professionalism looked like. He knew what talent looked like. He knew what it meant when someone showed up prepared, humble, and emotionally available. But Michael brought something that could not be taught. He brought a kind of innocence that did not feel performed. That innocence made John Coffey unforgettable. It is easy to forget how difficult that role truly was. John Coffey could have gone wrong in many ways. If played too softly, he might have seemed unrealistic. If played too forcefully, he might have lost the tenderness that defined him. If played too mysteriously, he might have become only a symbol instead of a man. Michael found the center. He made John Coffey both human and almost holy. He made him simple in speech, but deep in feeling. He made his fear heartbreaking because it came from someone who had every reason to be powerful, yet no desire to harm anyone. That was the contradiction that made the performance so devastating. And Tom Hanks' Paul Edgecombe became the character who had to carry the burden of seeing that truth too late. Their relationship on screen was not friendship in the normal sense. It was not easy. It was not equal. It was built inside a prison, under the shadow of death, with one man holding power and the other man trapped by a system that had already decided his fate. But emotionally, something shifted. Paul began as a guard. John became a revelation. The more Paul understood, the heavier the story became. And because Tom Hanks played that understanding with such quiet pain, Michael's performance became even more powerful. The two actors created a tragic rhythm. Duncan gave the audience purity. Hanks gave the audience conscience. Together, they made viewers ask what justice really means. That is why the film still hurts long after the final scene. It does not simply ask people to cry. It asks them to carry guilt. It asks them to look at a man like John Coffey and wonder how many gentle souls the world has misunderstood, condemned, or destroyed because it refused to see beyond fear. Michael Clarke Duncan understood what it meant to be seen only one way. For much of his early career, his body entered the room before his talent did. Casting directors could look at him and instantly imagine strength, threat, protection, intimidation. But the Green Mile allowed him to show the opposite. It allowed him to weaponize tenderness. It allowed him to prove that vulnerability can be more powerful than violence. That is what Tom Hanks seemed to honor when he remembered him. Not just the work, the humanity. Because when an actor dies, the public often talks about performances, awards, and famous scenes. Those things matter. But the people who knew them talk about smaller things. A laugh, a habit, a story, a kindness, a moment between takes, a memory that never reached the screen, but somehow mattered just as much. For Hanks, Michael was not frozen forever as John Coffey. He was a living, breathing man with humor, warmth, and a personality big enough to match his frame. That is why Hanks could bring laughter into a memorial. It was not disrespect. It was love. It was a way of saying, do not remember him only through tears. Remember the joy too. And maybe that is the part fans need most. Because Michael Clarke Duncan's story is filled with sadness, but it should not be reduced to sadness. He fought for his dream. He made it. He stood beside one of the biggest actors in the world and delivered a performance that nobody could ignore. He earned respect from critics, love from audiences, and loyalty from colleagues. That is not a small life. That is a life that broke through. The tragedy is that it ended too soon. The triumph is that it still echoes. Every time someone watches The Green Mile for the first time, Michael Clarke Duncan lives again in that moment. A new viewer sees him walk into the frame. A new viewer hears his voice. A new viewer realizes that this enormous man is not what they expected. And by the end, a new viewer understands why people never forgot him. That is legacy, not just fame. Legacy is when your work continues to create emotion after you're gone. Legacy is when people still speak your name with tenderness. Legacy is when a co-star like Tom Hanks remembers you not as a tragic headline, but as a gift discovered in the middle of a difficult story. Michael Clarke Duncan gave the world many performances, but with John Coffey, he gave something deeper. He gave people a reason to feel protective of innocence. He reminded them that strength without cruelty is possible. He showed that a giant can be gentle, and that gentleness can be unforgettable. And perhaps that is why Tom Hanks' tribute still resonates. It was not simply goodbye. It was a confirmation of what fans already felt. Michael Clarke Duncan was rare. Rare in talent. Rare in spirit. Rare in the way he could make a room laugh, then make a theater cry. And though the world lost him far too early, it did not lose what he gave. Because somewhere, every day, someone presses play on The Green Mile. And Michael Clarke Duncan returns. But there is another layer to this story, one that makes Tom Hanks' words about Michael Clarke Duncan feel even more meaningful. Hollywood is full of performances that impress people for a season and then disappear. A film comes out, audiences talk, critics write, awards are given, and then the world moves on. But every once in a while, a performance refuses to fade. It stays in the culture. It becomes part of the emotional memory of millions of people. Michael Clarke Duncan's John Coffey is one of those performances. And what makes it so extraordinary is that it was not built on vanity. It was not a role designed to make the actor look powerful, clever, charming, or heroic in the traditional sense. It was a role built on suffering, on silence, on fear, on innocence trapped inside a cruel world. Many actors want to be remembered as legends. Michael Clarke Duncan became unforgettable by making people want to protect him. That is a different kind of power. In The Green Mile, Tom Hanks carried the story with quiet authority. He was the familiar face, the trusted guide, the actor audiences already believed in. But Michael Clarke Duncan became the emotional shock. He was the discovery, the revelation. The man viewers thought they understood at first glance, only to realize they had misunderstood him completely. That is why the film's emotional force depends so much on him. Without Michael, John Coffey could have become only a tragic idea. With Michael, he became a soul. And when Tom Hanks later remembered him, that was what people heard beneath the words. He was not simply remembering a colleague from an old movie. He was remembering the man who gave that soul a body, a voice, a heartbeat. For Tom Hanks, the set of The Green Mile must have been a place filled with emotional weight. The story demanded sadness day after day. It asked actors to live inside a world of injustice, illness, execution, guilt, and moral helplessness. That kind of material can drain a cast. It can make the atmosphere heavy. It can follow people home after filming ends. But Michael Clarke Duncan brought light into that darkness. That is what so many people seem to remember about him. The ability to carry serious work without becoming consumed by it. He could step into heartbreak for the camera, then return to laughter when the scene was done. He could play a man crushed by pain, but off-screen, he could lift the mood of those around him. That contrast is beautiful. It also explains why his passing hurt so much. Because when people like Michael leave, the world does not only lose their talent, it loses their energy, their warmth, their timing, their stories, their ability to walk into a room and change how that room feels. Fans knew only part of him. Tom Hanks and his friends knew more. But even from a distance, audiences sensed something genuine. They sensed that Michael Clarke Duncan was not pretending to be humble. He seemed truly grateful for the chance to do what he loved. And that gratitude gave his career a special emotional texture. He was not careless with success. He knew what it cost to get there. He knew what it meant to be one of many struggling actors waiting for someone to see more than a large frame and a deep voice. He knew how easily the dream could have passed him by. But it did not. For one unforgettable moment, everything aligned. The right role, the right director, the right co-stars, the right emotional truth. And Michael Clarke Duncan walked into cinema history. That is why the story of Tom Hanks speaking about him still draws people in. It is not because fans want gossip. It is because they want confirmation that the feeling they had was real. They want to know that the man who moved them on screen was just as loved by the people who stood beside him. And Hanks' tribute gave them that. It told fans that Michael was not only admired, he was cherished. There is a difference. Admiration can be distant. Cherishing is personal. It comes from memories, from laughter, from shared work, from moments that never appear in interviews. It comes from seeing someone under pressure and realizing they remain kind. It comes from watching someone achieve something great without becoming arrogant. Michael Clarke Duncan seemed to leave that kind of impression. And perhaps that is the secret behind his lasting legacy. His greatest role was filled with sorrow, but the man himself was remembered with joy. That combination makes his memory richer. He was not only the actor who made people cry. He was also the man who made people smile when the cameras stopped rolling. So when people say Tom Hanks broke his silence, the deeper truth is not about scandal or hidden drama. The deeper truth is about remembrance. It is about one great actor honoring another. It is about the pain of losing someone too soon. It is about the strange immortality of film, where people can leave the world and still appear before us, young and alive, every time the story begins again. Michael Clarke Duncan is gone. But John Coffey still walks the mile. He still looks at Paul Edgecombe with frightened eyes. He still asks why the world is so cruel. He still makes audiences feel the terrible weight of innocence destroyed. And Tom Hanks, standing across from him in those scenes, still becomes the witness to that pain. That is why their work together remains timeless. It captured something larger than a movie. It captured the heartbreak of seeing goodness punished. It captured the helplessness of knowing the truth too late. It captured the beauty of a performer who gave everything to a role that demanded his whole heart. Michael Clarke Duncan may not have had enough years, but he had his moment. And what a moment it was. A moment so powerful that even now, long after the cameras stopped rolling, people still speak his name with emotion. Not because of scandal, not because of rumors, but because he made them feel something they never forgot. And yet, the story does not end with the sadness of Michael Clarke Duncan's passing. It continues in the way people still talk about him. That is the strange and beautiful thing about certain actors. They may leave the world physically, but something about them remains alive in conversation. A scene resurfaces online. A clip is shared. A younger viewer discovers the film for the first time. Someone hears that deep voice and feels the same emotion millions felt years ago. Michael Clarke Duncan still has that power. For many fans, The Green Mile is not just a movie they watched once. It is a film they remember emotionally. They remember where they were when they saw it. They remember the silence in the room. They remember the ending. They remember trying not to cry, then failing anyway. And at the center of that memory is Michael. Tom Hanks may have been the established star, but Duncan became the emotional wound of the film. He was the reason the story stayed with people. His performance made audiences feel the cruelty of judgment, the weight of innocence, and the tragedy of a world that often recognizes goodness only after it is too late. That is why Tom Hanks' tribute meant so much. Because it connected the public memory of Michael Clarke Duncan with the private memory of those who knew him. Fans saw John Coffey. Hanks saw Michael. And through his words, the two images came together. The gentle character who broke hearts on screen and the generous man who left warmth behind off screen. That is the kind of legacy no studio can manufacture. Studios can create posters. They can build campaigns. They can push award season narratives. But they cannot force audiences to love someone for decades. They cannot make a performance immortal unless something real is already there. Michael had that realness. He did not seem like a man acting gentle. He seemed like a gentle man acting. That difference is everything. It is why viewers believed him. It is why his tears felt honest. It is why his fear felt unbearable. It is why the audience did not simply watch John Coffey suffer. They suffered with him. And for Tom Hanks, acting beside that kind of truth must have been unforgettable. Hanks has spent a career playing men with conscience, dignity, uncertainty, and quiet moral strength. In The Green Mile, those qualities had to meet something even more fragile, Duncan's portrayal of innocence. The scenes between them worked because neither actor tried to steal the moment. They served the story. They trusted the silence. They let pain build naturally. That is why the film still feels powerful years later. Some performances age because they belong too much to their moment. Michael Clarke Duncan's performance does not. It still feels immediate. It still reaches people who were not even born when the film was released. It still makes viewers pause and ask why this man, this character, this soul, had to suffer so much. And behind that question is a deeper sadness. Michael Clarke Duncan himself was gone too soon. At 54, many performers are only beginning a new chapter, They start receiving richer roles, more complicated characters, stories that require life experience. Michael had that life experience. He had known struggle, discipline, disappointment, patience, and triumph. He could have brought all of that into roles that Hollywood had not yet imagined for him. But time ran out. That is the tragedy. Not just that a beloved actor died, but that a deeper second act never came. Fans never got to see the older Michael Clarke Duncan in a quiet drama about regret. They never got to see him mentor young actors through a powerful father figure role. They never got to see him take on the kind of complex, reflective performance that could have reminded Hollywood all over again of what he was capable of. Still, perhaps there is comfort in this. Michael Clarke Duncan did not need 100 perfect roles to prove his worth. He needed one that revealed his soul. And John Coffey did exactly that. The world saw him, truly saw him, not as a bodyguard, not as the muscle, not as the background figure beside someone else's fame. For once, the audience looked at Michael Clarke Duncan and saw the full contradiction that made him extraordinary. Strength and softness, power and vulnerability, size and innocence. That is why people still return to him. And that is why Tom Hanks' remembrance remains important. In Hollywood, where careers are often measured in box office numbers, awards, and headlines, Hanks' words pointed to something more lasting: character. He reminded people that Michael was not only a performance, he was a presence. A man whose personality, humor, and kindness stayed with those around him. That kind of memory matters. Because fame fades faster than people think. Headlines disappear. Trends move on. New stars arrive. New scandals take over the conversation. But genuine affection lasts longer. When people remember how someone made them feel, that memory becomes harder to erase. Michael Clarke Duncan made people feel safe. He made them feel moved. He made them feel that gentleness could survive inside a harsh world, even if the world did not always protect it. And maybe that is why his story still hurts. Because in some way, Michael's own life mirrored the emotional truth of his most famous role. People saw his size first. Then, if they looked closer, they saw his heart. By the time they fully understood what he had given, he was gone. But gone does not mean forgotten. Not for Tom Hanks. Not for the fans. Not for anyone who watched The Green Mile and felt their heart break in a way they could not explain. Michael Clarke Duncan remains one of those rare performers whose legacy is not built on quantity, but impact. He did not leave behind endless decades of leading roles. He left behind one performance so pure, so painful, and so deeply human that it became permanent. And sometimes, permanence is the greatest tribute of all.